What is up, everybody? Svenddiesel here with Sportsman's Warehouse. We're going to be tying up the Sparkle Minnow, an extremely effective pattern out west for trout. But let's run through the material list. First, we're going to start with this Umpqua streamer hook. It's a TMC 9395 in a size 4. We're going to go with a tungsten cone on this, a 6.5 millimeter. This is a River Wilds product. And for the securing that head on, we're going to be using some .025 lead wire. You can also use lead free. This is what I have available. And right now we're going to use a white UTC 140 Denier thread. A little bit heavier denier for the streamer to hold all our dubbing loops in place. And for the tail on this, we're going to use some Strung Marabou. I've tied this in white and golden brown. You could also do white and brown, add a little bit of yellow. We're going to add some copper flash. So there's kind of a lot of variance in the tail especially, but this is a pretty standard pattern that doesn't need a lot of tweaking. For the body, we're going to be using this Spirit River Lite-brite gold and this hairline dubbing ice dub UV. I've also used ice dub in the gold, but I like how this is a little bit longer of a flowing material, and we'll use some Loon thin and also some fly tire Z-ment made by Wapsi. And I think that's pretty much it. So let's go ahead and get started. First things first is we're going to grab that wire and break off a little bit a piece. You can also put this on a spool if you're worried about wasting any material, but you want to put 8 to 10 wraps, just enough to shove up into that cone, because this is a tungsten cone, so it's going to kind of nosedive on us as we're fishing this, and that's kind of a little bit of an important thing with a minnow, because then when you pull it, it's going to go up. But I kind of just slid that up to secure the cone, and then I'll start my thread right here behind the lead wire, and then I'll kind of wrap over that tag end, and then do some zigzagging wraps throughout that lead wire. And then I'll just kind of pull that off with my finger. It should be a little bit soft. You don't need to use scissors or anything, but we will cut our tag end out at this point. And then I'll just proceed to wrap down the shank of the hook with this white thread and end right as it starts to bend. And we're going to be tying in a bicolor two-tone tail, white and the golden brown. And as mentioned earlier, I've tried it in white and regular brown, rusty brown, but I really like to use the white on the bottom, and I like to use it a little heavier than the brown. And that'll make sense here in a minute, because I'll show you I use 2 of these feathers off this Strung Marabou. I just grab a feather and I cut out the tip. That way we're just dealing with wispy fibers, because you can see where I'm going to tie this in now. We have no stem, and so it's just going to be free flowing. And I'll just tie that in on the top of the shank with about 5 to 6 wraps. Working my way up towards the cone, and then I'll just trim that out. And we're not going to worry too much about uniform body on this, but if you want, you could cut that at an angle. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to do twice as much white as we are the brown. Now, you need to not always use that as a rule of thumb, but with Strung Marabou, generally you're going to be getting about the same amount of fibers on each feather. Give or take, a little bit, and so you'll just have to judge. But here I'm not going to cut it off at the same part. I'm going to go up a little bit further and then cut it so that we just don't have like a hump there. And so I'm doing a little bit of taper, which will make it easier in the end, but like I said, we're not too concerned about the underbody. And then here I'll do some over-under wraps and have that Marabou kind of go down into the bend a little bit. Now we're going to get out the golden brown at this point, and I'm just going to grab one feather, making sure these were all about the same, and that 2-to-1 ratio should work perfectly. If you don't want to do 2-to-1, you don't have to. This is just something I prefer to do. And so I'll just do the same process, cut out the tip, lay it up on top, and I'm going to have that go a little bit longer than my white. And that's just a personal preference. I think it adds a little bit more dimension, because if you ever look at a minnow or baitfish, it seems like the darker colors extend into the tail a little bit more, but we're talking not enough to really matter. So just kind of clean up your body at this point. Make sure that we got the two-tone going on. I think that's kind of critical on this fly. And then we're going to take off about 5 pieces of the Krystal flash. This is the copper, and I'll just trim it right close to the zip tie, and then I will line up this one side even with the end of the Marabou fibers. I'll tie it on. As you can see, I'm kind of pinching it down with my thumb so it doesn't move, and I'll do about 3 wraps forward, and then I'll pull this up without pulling it out of place, and then kind of gradually wrap it down so that it intersects at that split on the tail, and then I'll do some nice securing wraps over that, and that looks pretty good. I'm going to check to make sure. It was almost perfect. I like to trim the Krystal flash as long as the longest fibers of the tail, and you can cut them a little bit shorter if you want. And we're going to make our first dubbing loop at this point. It doesn't have to be super long. This just needs to be longer than the tie-off point right there behind the tungsten cone. I do mine about 1 inch longer. It makes it a little bit easier to work with. And most people, when they tie this fly, they're going to take this dubbing loop and they're going to set it aside. However, I found that later on the process, the eye stub in the gold and the tail and everything, it makes it really hard for me personally to tie it in. And so what I do right here is I'm just going to put my dubbing loop tool into the dubbing loop we just made. I'll hold it on the material clip, a little helpful tip there, and then I'll grab my material so that way my dubbing loop is ready to go. I'll take this eye stub, I'm going to pull out a pretty good chunk here, and I'm going to stack the fibers so that they're all about the same length. And I'm just basically tugging on the one side, pulling out the longer fibers, and then placing it right over the center of the existing fibers in my left hand. That's called stacking. And for this, we want to make sure that our eye stub we're pretty much only going the length of the fly. So you don't need to spread this out in the entire loop, but I don't want to have it be chunky, monkey in certain spots. And so I'll just kind of push that a little bit closer. And if you want to apply some dubbing wax, you can do that as well onto your thread so that it doesn't slip on you. And I got a piece of Krystal flash going in there. I don't want that mixed in. I'm just going to pull it out. So now we're uneven. It's never going to catch a fish. We got 5 fibers on one side and 3 or 4 on the other. So this isn't going to work anymore. Oh, I'm kidding. So spin that up real nice. Grab your dubbing, a little brush. This is put out by Peak, and I'm just going to brush it roughly so that those fibers are kind of coming out a little bit more, and that way we are ready to go for when we are going to finish this fly. A little key here is I want to make sure that this tie-in point for the dubbing loop is right there on the center. So you can see right there it's kind of on my side, so I'm just going to take my thread holding that dubbing loop up and get it nice in there snug and make sure that that is right there on center. And then I'll just use a hair clip here. I inserted it into a hackle plier, and I'll put a hair clip up here on my vise, and that way that is out of our way. So some people do that at the end. I like to get that out of the way now. So we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to create a dubbing loop. This one's going to be a little bit longer because we're going to palmer it, and it's a pretty fine line to judge how much material to put in. Normally, it's easier to just put in a little bit too much more and waste it, but we'll see how it goes. And don't be afraid if you put in too little to do a second dubbing loop, and that way you can judge how thick the body is. That's what's more important, how much material we put on the body, not wasting a little bit of material. So here we go. We're just going to pull out a fairly good chunk, and this is why I like this material over using eye stub for this. Is it's long, it's very flowy. It seems a little bit more flowy than eye stub, but what I do is I fold it in half and I cut it so that they're not super long, and then I stack it a little bit so that it's kind of even, and then I'll just trim out any really long fibers. And the other advantage to having this longer fiber is you can judge how much you want the body. I mean, you can trim eye stub, but I can't ever go longer than what it has. And this here, I can manipulate it for some bigger streamers, and this one being a little bit larger. And I'll go ahead and insert that into my dubbing loop, and we'll see how it spins up. And it should be, that might be a little bit not enough. The pressure of tying on these videos. But I'll go ahead and spread that out and just roughly estimate about how even we want it. I want it to be semi-close up to the body of the fly, but if you have a lot of fibers there, it's going to pull the Marabou in. And so we'll just go ahead and start spinning this in to create our body material. And we'll just go ahead and spin. And you can see how these longer fibers want to really suck into the core of this, and that's why it's important that you brush it out before palmering it around. And I kind of just put my finger on the other side so that I'm brushing against something. because if you get too aggressive, you could sometimes break your thread. We are using 140 denier, however, you know, that you could break it in theory. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to just give it a little bit spin, a little twist there, make sure we're good to go. And then the last step, I want to apply a generous amount of super glue down, and this is kind of key. We're solidifying the marabou to the thread, to the shank of the hook. I'm letting it absorb in. I'm gluing the lead wraps at this point, so all of that's just soaking in, and then while it's still wet, I'm going to come around and start palmering this. Just be careful not to get that super glue on your hand, particularly your left hand as you're palmering, stroking those fibers back. And we don't need to go as heavy back here at the rear of the fly because it does have that thicker diameter, but you kind of have to judge. You can see how it's kind of clumpy right there in certain sections on my loop, whereas here we're moving into a thinner section. So those wraps that are thinner I'm going to do tighter together, and the ones that are a little bit clumpier I can kind of space out a little bit, but not too much. And it looks like I didn't put enough material in. So this is a great example of how to show you how we're going to do a second dub loop. So I'm just going to tie that off by doing a wrap in front and behind. We'll trim that out, and then I'll just create a little small dubbing loop here. Same process, wrap back over your wraps to a point. I happen to have a little bit of this material that has fallen out or that I trimmed earlier, so I'm just going to use that and slip it in. It looks about the same right amount and a good length, so I'll just spin that up real fast. And then another key thing, whenever you do this adding a secondary dubbing loop, I always want to make sure to put a little bit of super glue down, just to make sure that our tie off point and then adding this is going to be solid. And that's just to make sure it's a durable fly, and that is something that's always been proven effective and useful for me. So little tip there. And as we get up here towards the eye, we've got a little bit of room. We can work material into the cone, but I'm just going to tie it off like that. That looks pretty good. And then the next step is we're just going to clean up that head just a little bit to make sure we got everything secure before we brush this. I'm going to grab that same brush tool, and I'm going to do, on the first step, I'm just going to kind of get as many fibers out of the wraps we did. I was pretty good when I palmered it, but you're still going to be trapping some wraps, and so just do some zigzaggy motions through here, and then you can see we're starting to see how this looks when it's shaped, and some of these fibers are a little bit long, and so we can do a trim job. But I really like how those are going to flow into the tail, so I leave them a little bit longer. They've got a really nice taper to them. We have a solid core and a great taper. What else do we need? So I brushed those fibers down now, and if you were doing this the traditional way, you would at this point make a grab your dubbing loop, throw the ice dub in, but since we already made it, I'm just going to preen these fibers back to the best of my ability. We're going to kind of tie in the clump I have right here, and that's going to be the nice throat on this fly. I'll do a wrap over and then kind of work my way around my hackle plier here, and if it twists on you, that's okay. Just realign it before we finish it, and we'll go ahead and do 2 wraps over the top. I did one or two wraps in front, and then what we're going to do is trim it out, but not like flush. You want to leave just a tad bit of room, and that's what I'm going to use to really sink this down and get it into that cone, and that is going to make it ultra durable. So that is pretty much the fly, and that looks solid. Man, that looks fishy. So let's do a 3-turn whip finish, and then what we're going to do is grab some of that Loon thin, and I'm going to kind of do a little inject it into that tungsten cone just to finish off the whip finish, and also to fill that void with the resin. So go ahead and grab it, make sure there's not a drop already coming out of it, but we'll just kind of spread that around right here. I'm kind of pushing it so it goes into that void, and then I'll just clean up. I don't want the resin to be all over the cone, so I'll just use my finger to clean that up a little bit, and then we'll go ahead and cure it. And that is the Sparkle Minnow. You can articulate these, add a secondary hook to this, tandem with some braided line, or I've tied them on jigs so it's riding hook point up. Just invert your colors, but it doesn't need to be changed. It's a super effective pattern for trout. I like these longer fibers on top. It flows a little bit better and it gives a little bit bigger profile. So This last step to take it out of my vise, put it in my hand, grab a black Sharpie and just run it right here along the back of the fly on the top of the shank. If you could see the hook shank still, basically put a little dark back to this. I can blend it into the Marabou a little bit and then kind of check it from the side. You don't need a lot. You don't want it to be totally black, but this really increases it and makes it the official Coffey's version of the sparkle minnow, effective in most western waters for trout. And so tie some up, fish them. Thanks for watching and hope you enjoyed it.